right, let's go ahead and get started on page number 15. The title for this week's lesson is still part of part one, which is preparing for the field, but this one is called Evangelism Begins at Home. Let's read the opening salvo, as we'll call it this morning for this, and then we're going to talk about it just a little bit. When my kids were younger, we loved the Denver Zoo. We had an annual membership and visited frequently. It's amazing to see how all the animals live, move, and react to one another and their audience in habitats built to resemble their natural environments. My son, Noah, really liked the elephants. For my daughter, Gabrielle, it was all about the bears and lions. But she needed a little reassurance to get near them, especially when there's no glass between the animals and us. Typically, when we came to the lions and bears, Gabrielle would turn to me and ask, "Daddy, can you fight them?" Of course, this made me feel very powerful and heroic, especially when other dads were watching me and waiting for my response. I would stick out my chest and proudly answer, "Yes, I can fight them." Then we would laugh, and Gabrielle would go back to watching the bears. It was easy to convince her of my bravery when the bears and lions were safely behind a large barrier. It would have been a different story had we come upon them in the wild. Animals kept safely in a zoo is a good way to describe what man often does to God. We try to keep a wild God within walls behind a protective barrier. God seems a lot safer there, where our contact with him was more controlled and contained. The idea of keeping God in a place apart from us is not a new concept. In Exodus 40, 34, and 35, we read about a time when God was contained in a place with four walls and unapproachable by man. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. So I've drawn up here on the board. What does this particular drawing, you think, stand for?
A box.
Yeah. God in a box. Or
we keep him in a box.
We try to put God, I'm going to rephrase it, in our box. Not just any box. It has to be our box. Mm-hmm. And guess how many different boxes people try to put God in? You know,
how many people are there in the world?
Yeah. Some people don't even want to believe that he exists, right? But this really stirred up my thought process, because what advantages do we believe that we have by putting God in our box? What are some advantages that we believe we have? I'm not saying that those advantages truly exist, but what do we believe are advantages to putting God in our box? And what does it mean? Well, first of all, let's answer that question. What do you think it means to put God in your box?
It's a jack in the box. We can close the lid and keep him in there where we want.
All right, so first advantage would be what?
Control.
Access.
Okay, I'm going to ask you to sing it.
And then controlled. Yeah. In other words, unless we turn that crank, we don't want him to come out of that box. Why?
We don't have control. We don't answer to him to do what
when he's out of the box.
We don't have answer to him.
When he's out of the box, there's more accountability, right?
And when we're done using him, we shove him back in and lock the lid again.
I mean, Alan, I don't know about you, when I was thinking about this week, it really hit me. We get a bad diagnosis from the doctor. What do?
We get down on our knees.
We take him out of the box. everything's going well, we put him back. I can imagine what that's like for God. But the only thing I could relate it to was when I was in school, I had this girl that would say she liked me and wanted to be my girlfriend one minute, and then the next minute she didn't. And it felt like that yo-yo, you know what I mean? So, I mean, that's probably a terrible analogy, but it's kind of the way I think.
Convenience.
Yeah. He becomes our God of convenience, and we call upon him when we need him, and we forget him when things are going great.
It seemed like they treated the Ark of the Covenant that way.
Yeah.
Like it was a secret weapon. And, they forgot that it was representation of God.
Mm-hmm.
And, we do that with all kinds of things.
So I think number one is true. We like him in a box because we feel like we can control the access. What are some other ways? What are some other self-deluded advantages to putting God in our box?
Personal. We want him to be out.
Want him to be our God?
No, possession.
Possession. Okay. I'm probably misspelling. Possession, right? What do they say? Possession is 9/10. That's interesting, isn't it? Because if you believe you possess God, then you believe you have the ability to control what laws and what rules that God sets. If you believe that, well, if I possess God, then my particular sin, God's not going to look at my sin as roughly as he would look at Brother Joe or Brother Jim or Sister Susie or, what. You see what I'm saying about that?
Is that kind of like the way the Pharisees did it? Like they owned God
Yeah.
or something because of their obedience to the law?
I think you're right. I think they felt like they've done these things, so they have earned the right to put him in their box.
When he's hidden, he can't see. We believe he can't see what we do wrong. So he's hidden.
Yeah. So access, that's sort of that controlled access, right? His eyes, we want to control what his eyes can or cannot see. Is there anything else that we may feel like is an advantage to putting God in our box?
Tell other people what we believe he wants them to hear. Not what he wants us to teach others, but what we want to teach others about him.
Okay. So, can I say doctrinally?
Mm-hmm.
If he's in our box, then we can dictate doctrinally what
We are seeing his words are telling us.
Yeah.
And not what we're supposed to.
In other words, instead of allowing his spirit to
guide us
identify the meaning
of what he wants
we
us
put
to
him in that box, we now define.
Yeah.
It's not to limit God to what we understand of him.
Okay.
Not who he really is, but just what our limited understanding is of him.
So I like to look at it this way, and I think this fits in what you're saying. We have a finite mind, right? And we're trying to place an infinite mind. Yeah. Or no, we're trying to impose our finite mind upon an infinite God. And that generally doesn't work well. I think part of the reason, though, that we're having this discussion is, don't we sometimes place God in a box about who we believe he will and will not save? Did we ever, and this is another, I started to write this instead, and maybe I'll just go ahead and do this. I think it fits this part of the discussion. We try to put God's grace in a box. I mean, does anybody in this room claim to know the extent of God's grace? I don't. What's some of the songs that we sing that talks about His grace?
Amazing grace.
Amazing grace, infinite, wonderful, matchless grace, right? We'll sing about it. We'll call it all those things. And then when it comes to that grace for ourselves, His grace reaches me, but I'm not sure it reaches
Others.
right. So I think this is all just a way that, like the author is saying, we do this to keep God at arm's length. And I think for some of us in the church, like myself, I can't speak for anybody else, but my relationship to God for many years was limited by the box that I had put Him in many of those ways that y'all described. And I think part of that was maybe the scriptural outlook that I had as a child. It was all about rules and regulations and dotting every I and crossing every T. And every time you messed up, you worried that God was going to strike you down. I seriously am not kidding with you when I tell you there were points in my life as a teenager where I seriously thought I was gone because of whatever sin that I had committed that particular week.
But Jonathan, I've been thinking lately, I think I've gotten too lax. It's like, oh, well, God will forgive me.
Yeah, well, you certainly can go that way with
So,
it as well.
It's a fine line to keep it in.
And I think we struggle too, because when we look at the God that we read about in the Old Testament, right? Read about God in the Old Testament. Do you remember a point in time where a man tried to steady the ark?
Yeah.
He died.
And he died?
Yeah.
Well, there were two of them, wasn't there?
There was more than just him,
Yeah.
but he was the one that tried to steady the ark and died. But what we forget about that particular account,
We're doing it the wrong way.
well, not only that, they were inebriated. Not this. This is a different situation, but the strange fire. Nadab and Abihu, right? What people forget about that story is that they were drunk. It wasn't just that they offered strange fire. I've heard that preached my entire life. Yes, it was wrong. They offered the wrong fire. But what was the reason they were punished the way they were? Because they were drunk and they did not care to keep God's rule. It was the heart of the matter that meant more to God in that moment. That we don't always talk about that. We just look at it as, well, they did set the wrong fire, boom. It's an easy story to tell, but there's another side to both of these stories in that God spared hundreds of thousands of other people in those moments. He could have very easily wiped out 100,000 Jews in that moment because of that sin, but they were spared by His grace.
I was going to say, because God is a God of grace doesn't mean He's a God of whatever. He's
Right.
also a God of justice as well. And He's a God of grace, but He loves justice. And there's things that as parents we have to do to teach our children what we stand for and what we believe is the right way to behave. And it's not always a pleasant thing for the kid or for us, but
No.
it's part of discipline and them learning who we are and our expectations as well.
And it's interesting, Lori, when you bring that up, because I, like a lot of you, did anybody in here have a father that was pretty strict?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that kind of ruled with a very authoritative tone.
Yep.
How about brutal?
Brutal, okay. But did any of you ever see your dad, once you had children, and you go, wait, that wasn't the
That's
father.
not the man that raised me.
Dan and I have been accused of that after our grandkids came along.
Yeah, I've heard people say about their fathers or whatnot, they mellowed in their old age. They became, more loving as they got older. And if we're not careful, I think we're doing that with God. From the Old Testament, we go, if you're describing God, the Father aspect of God in the Old Testament, how would you have described him? Some people describe him as what?
Mean old man.
Mean old man, tyrant.
Waiting to zap us.
Yeah, all those things are, prominent the way people view God of the Old Testament. And then they look at the God of the New Testament and they go, what?
Wow, he's like really soft.
So it's kind of an oxymoron that we go, God is a God that will never change. He's the same yesterday, today, tomorrow, and forever. And then people look at him and go, that God of the Old Testament was a mean old man. That God of the New Testament is graceful and loving. That's the problem.
I made a statement one night when Barry Day was here, and I said, I'm glad I live under the New Testament because we have grace. And he corrected me. He said, grace is all over the Old
There you
Testament.
go.
He said, even though, Cain slew Abel, even though Cain killed his brother, God prepared a place for him.
Sure did.
He sent him, he didn't just zap him right then. He gave him grace. And if we look for it, it is all in the Old Testament.
And that's the point I'm trying to make, is that in this process of putting God in this box, we've decided that God now fits a certain image. And how, even our society, are they not doing this?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, 50 years
pro
ago.
or con, because you hear so often if he was a loving God.
Oh, I've heard it. I mean, so often that it's shocking sometimes that I've even heard my own brethren make statements that way.
Ask Ananias and Sapphira if there was a difference.
Yeah.
Well, there are people that claim to be Christians, and then something drastic or detrimental in their life happens, and then they just turn their back.
Yeah.
Like
They blame
it was
God
like it was
for
his
it.
fault.
Fell among the thorns and the weeds.
I think one of the greatest parts of this chapter, if you've read it, is that he talks about how in modern religion, we've built all these grand cathedrals and all these things that are just what or many people would call sacred places, that God resides in these places, right? Yet wasn't it Jesus who told the woman at Samaria it's no longer going to be about that?
Yeah, he goes into that right there when he's talking about those cathedrals.
How many have been to New Orleans?
He talks about New Orleans.
He sure did.
Too. Yeah.
Talk about that. What's in the middle of that area that's so immoral?
He writes
About the church building.
Yep.
Cathedral that's right there in the middle of it.
So the point of this particular chapter that really stood out to me, and I want you to talk about it, is, and it's so true. We take our church, and I'm going to use that word church in the phrase of church building. Okay. What are some things that we would say are improper to do in a church building?
Laugh.
Oh, I thought you said math, and I'm like,
No, laugh.
Laugh.
For
Laugh.
anywhere.
I would say that's improper.
Laugh
That's improper.
I don't know about laugh. We laugh a lot in the church building. What do we think is something improper to do in a church building? I'll give you
Sleep and eat.
Dance.
dance. Okay, that's true. I'm not going to put numbers because I don't want it to be thought of as a list of what is and greatest or least.
Right.
Dance, yeah.
My granddaughter wanted my daughter-in-law and I to dance something the other night. She was playing Felice Tommy Don, and she wanted us to dance to it, and Jacob was laughing at us, and Chris said, "We're good Christians, good Church of Christ girls. We don't know how to."
What are some other things that we wouldn't do in a church building?
Use obscene language.
language. You know, I've been a part of the church my whole life. I've never seen somebody in the church building stick the middle finger at somebody else inside the church building. It's funny, before every Rockets game, I have this script that I have to read pre-game. It's called the Code of Conduct, and it talks about foul language and gestures.
And I don't obey it.
You're not supposed to do those things inside the arena. Otherwise, you could be ejected and possibly arrested. Well, okay, church building, we wouldn't use foul language or obscene gestures, right? What else would we not do inside a church building?
Drink alcohol.
What'd she say?
Drink alcohol.
We're not supposed
Although
to.
some of those communion cups I'm getting.
Was it pretty funny? Yeah.
Some churches use alcohol in their communion.
Yeah, they do.
Smoke.
Oh, yeah.
I will tell you though, I remember a time in my life where when you opened the doors outside the church building, the
Yeah.
smoke would hit you.
Yeah.
What else? What about
Take drugs that are harmful drugs.
oh, who said that one? Yeah. I mean let's don't make light of that. I've known
Yep.
men I've known men that would beat their wives at home, but then come to church and act like they love their wife and they're the sweetest thing that
My dad was an elder in a church where the elders had to make a decision that was not popular, and one of the deacons wanted to fight my dad at the church. And another elder had to step between them to keep him from doing it.
I've heard a church member say about another church member who was up speaking that I was going to go up there and beat the living daylights out of him.
Armed and ready to kill.
In Christian love.
What else?
Play a musical instrument.
A musical instrument. Wow. Yeah, I will tell you that I was scolded at one church that I was at because I played a guitar in a fellowship hall.
Oh, yeah.
My mother
Fellowship
didn't
hall.
believe you should have a fellowship hall.
You want me to add that too?
That goes along with that
Yeah.
anti
Yeah,
thing.
yeah, it's true.
And I dislike that word terribly.
What else?
We used to have an elder here years ago that if you played an instrument in any of these buildings, that was a no-no.
Well, I can tell you that I don't know if it's here, but I know in other churches I've served at, in their articles of incorporation, there is a section that talks about no musical instruments shall be brought on the campus. In other words, you can't.
Well, as of 10 years ago, 15, it applied here too. Because I asked.
What else? There's some things that we're missing here.
Phones,
What's that?
porn,
Phones.
Porn?
movies, things like that.
Let me put it to you like this. Watch.
Yeah, stay quiet, but we do it in our homes, but we feel we kind of.
Well, that's the whole point of this. I think you're probably getting this already, just with what I'm saying, but I don't know.
if we read the lessons,
That
that is
stuff.
what you are trying to show us, that what he's teaching us, that
Yeah.
we hold one place holy and the other place is not.
Immodest dress.
Yeah. Just put in modesty. How about that?
What are you talking about me?
I'm talking about Charles.
Now, these are all things that are not permitted in the church building, but vice versa, you would think. of
Here's the point of all this. If you read the chapter, these are all things that we would go, oh, how dare that ever happen in a church building. But we leave here on Sundays and we go home, and a lot of our homes,
It's all of those things and more.
a lot of our homes of Christians have some, not saying that they have all, but many of the
Smoke in
homes.
my house. I smoke in the front porch.
I laugh, but I will encourage you, just like I encourage my father, not to do that. Just
No, you're not the only one.
and guys, we shouldn't take this too lightly, because the problem for me when I read this chapter is, how can I be evangelistic in my own home? How can I, especially with children, right?
Mhm.
How can I be a real evangelist at home if these things are going on and my kids are having to witness those things in the home, and then we walk in the church building on Sunday and Daddy looks like the most pious guy in the church?
That's why so many were raised, and walked away going nothing but a bunch of hypocrites.
That's right.
Yeah, and that's something that has always stood out to me, Alan. We talk about so often, why is the church losing so many of our young people? And you can't really, I think the problem is you can't really take a big brush and just paint over that with the answer. But I'm going to tell you, I think that we're losing some of our young people because we've been such poor consistency in terms of our Christ likeness. We come to church and and listen, I'm not standing up here like I'm perfect. There have been times in the car on the way here that I've wanted to kill my kids. And then you get out of the car.
Good to see you, brother.
Yeah.
Isn't it a wonderful day?
Well, part of the problem is that some parents expect all of the teaching to come from what they take them to church for.
Yeah, they expect
Do it at home.
They expect a preacher or a youth minister or both to be the example that they should be. Not just teaching, but the example.
Well, the church building should have relationships that are correct or that are encouraging. And a lot of it, like with my children, it was to a point and then it wasn't. Does
Well,
that make sense?
I think the problem sometimes is we expect our churches to be perfect. We expect perfection out of our local church, right? Am I wrong or right about that?
Yep.
We expect every preacher, every youth minister, every elder, every deacon to meet our standard. And I'm going to be honest with you, I've been a youth minister before. Was I perfect in the way I ministered to every child who came through that door? No. And I'm sure there are children that I let down, that I didn't give the encouragement that they needed at that particular moment. That's not a good thing. I'm not standing up here telling you it's a good thing. It's a terrible thing.
But again, it's because the parents put that in their mind that the preacher or the minister or the youth minister supposed to be able to teach you and do everything perfect for you.
Well, what I would say, Myrna, is that when you send your kids to church, you need to make sure they understand that the people at church are imperfect people, just like you're imperfect.
Exactly. I know, and that's what I'm trying to say, is that we as parents sometimes make it to believe that when you go to church, everything is going to be perfect, everything is going to be right, but it's not.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you a great example, okay? When I was a junior in high school, we got a youth minister, okay? And he really, I was still kind of the awkward, not popular kid. And I'll never forget this as long as I live. Brother Bill Gill was one of our elders, one of the greatest shepherds I've ever known. He was watching us playing basketball one night with this particular youth minister. And he saw how that youth minister was excluding me from what they were doing. purposefully, just with the other kids, but just kind of pushing me off to the side. I never would say anything. I just would let it go because that's kind of the way I was raised. But I'll never forget, I didn't know it happened that night. But Bill Gill went to him and said, if I ever see you isolating the children like that again, you can go back to your office and find another place to go. I didn't know about that until maybe 5 or 7 years later when I was having lunch with him, and he was talking to me about how I had developed and grown over the years and how he had always wanted to see me become the person that I was becoming. And he knew that I didn't have my dad at church. My dad was not with us. And so he kind of took it personally to help bring me up. So when he was talking to that particular youth minister, he wasn't talking to him so much as an elder to a youth minister. He was talking to him as a father standing up for his son. And I'll never forget that as long as I live. But the point is, that youth minister and I today, we're good. We're good. I'm serious. We're good. I've talked to him many times over the years. He's even admitted to me over the years that he didn't see in me what he should have saw. And I told him, I don't blame you. I wouldn't have saw it in me either. But thank goodness that at home, I had a mama who was absolutely consistent. Because if I'd went home every day and my dad was unfaithful, and I knew that, but if my mom was telling me one thing and living another, I wouldn't be here today. And I think far too often, it's because, as this author says, we don't invite God into our home. Because when we put God in a box, you ever had an outside dog that you wouldn't let in the house?
Yeah.
I've had one. What kind of relationship do you think I had with that dog? Not very good.
Very good.
All of our dogs lived outside and we had good relations.
Good. We did. For me personally, when I've had an outside dog that I've kept in a doghouse or in a
We
fence,
keep them in a doghouse. They were tearing up our yard.
I just had a different relationship with that particular dog versus the dog that was with me every day and lived in the house. And is it possible that that's what's going on in our home? That we've put God out in the God house? Isn't that interesting? You turn that around, D-O-G, G-O-D.
It's easier when you have that separation, the human with the dog, to not see them as a viable life.
Right.
And people do the same thing with each other,
Oh, they do.
both in society.
Husbands and wives do it with each other.
We do it with God, or people try to do it with God, not so much as a seriousness, a interaction, if we try to keep it separate.
Well,
I know in this class, I think a lot of us over the last few months have discovered how our relationship with God should have been so much more for so long in our life, but it's been kind of less than that because we've kept God outside.
God is supposed to be in the church building, not outside.
Yeah, that's the way we were taught.
Yeah.
And I did just the opposite, like Charles said. I had God in a box, and it was my possession. I carried him with me wherever I went. Nobody else could have him. It was me and my family. That was it.
That's part of compartmentalizing too, I think, is
Yeah.
we leave here and put our God box on the shelf, and then we get our sports box or entertainment box or a job box or whatever. You know?
There was a church I was preaching at back home in Alabama right when Jennifer and I married. And there was this brother in the church. And every Sunday he would take his Bible and he would put it up in the but by the window, the dash area of his car. He had a longer dash, and he would toss his Bible up there after church,
It's there next Sunday.
and it would be in the same spot. I told Jennifer, I mean, we were just got married. I was like, if I was doing that, I would at least move it out of the different areas so somebody wouldn't see it sitting there the whole week. But maybe that's what's going on. Maybe that's what this chapter is telling us, that, for a lot of us, we're not a natural evangelist because we're not authentic. And you can't be authentic if you don't have an authentic relationship with God yourself. And some of us have struggled to have that authentic relationship with God. I know I have. I know it's felt better to put God in my box and bring him out whenever I needed him. And don't bring him out when I'm at home and I'm watching a TV show I shouldn't watch. Don't bring him out when I'm listening to music I shouldn't listen to. You see what I'm saying here?
Or you made it at the game.
Yeah. Don't bring him out at that moment, because what he's going to see or hear in that moment, we don't want him to see or hear. But the reality is, what?
He already knows.
He already knows.
Jonathan?
I have a problem because I've seen what's going on, and I think electronics have a lot to do with upbringing of kids, and it's so dwell into it, even the parent also. Even if they're walking the street, they're on the phone, they bump into you. Sometimes I have to pull people out because a car is coming and they want to cross the street. So that's how committed they are. They have I work in the health field. They have their computer giving drugs out, but they have the phone right there looking at them.
Yeah.
How can you focus?
Yeah. This is a drug. Yeah, you're exactly. This is the new opium. It really is.
Driving and they're on their phone.
And I actually was reading a study about this the other day, that this produces dopamine.
Yep.
Do you realize that? It produces dopamine.
The release of endorphins and dopamine.
Yeah. I mean, the same things that sexual intimacy and drugs and alcohol release, this is able to do the same thing. And they named it. You ever been stressed? For those of you that use Facebook, what do you do when you're stressed and you pull up Facebook? What do? You scroll and look at other people's stuff. And you'll just, sit there, just keep scrolling.
And even though you're doing the same thing, and if the kids give a problem, they buy another electronics for them.
Yeah.
So that means they have no.
We're breeding that into our children, yes. And nowadays, if I'm just being honest with you, there's a lot of stuff you come across on Facebook you should not be seeing or hearing. Some of it's our own fellow Christians putting stuff on there we should not see and hear. And it saddens me sometimes when I'm scrolling on Facebook and I come across a post like that, and some of our own brethren have liked or loved that post, and you're like, what? But
this is why I'm afraid to open that up on my laptop. I can't do it.
But you can't hide from the fact that it's actually in existence too. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but
Hear no evil. What is that old statement? Hear,
see
no evil.
I'm honest. I got to be honest with you. I resent having to rely on electronics to be able to contact with the information from the
Understand.
church.
Totally understand.
Yeah.
So the final thing that I'm going to say before we dismiss, and we're at the last minute. Here's the problem that I think we should be very cognizant of. We've taken a lot of church and a lot of evangelism, and we've also put that in a box, and that box is these four walls. And our last book really opened our eyes to a little bit of that. And as far as our relationship to God, if the majority of your relationship with God takes place within these four walls, this church building, then what kind of relationship do you really have? Not much. And if the only true evangelism that takes place with our children or our wife or our family is within these four walls, then at home, we're not going to be very effective in evangelism. How can you be natural evangelists if at home these are the things that naturally come about in your existence? All right, thank you all very, very much. Love you very, very much. Let's pray together before we close up. Father, thank you so much for this class. I know, Father, we've got a lot of our folks working over with Impact today, and I ask that you would bless them and their service to you and their service to the good folks down at Impact, especially those who are needy, Father. I know, Father, that you're using those people, but we miss them, and we thank you for their service, especially after the sermon this morning, that they're willing to serve in that nature. Pray, Father, you'd help us all find areas of service here today, tomorrow, to the rest of this week, to be your servants and your stewards, faithfully giving you the glory in all things that we do. So, Jesus, that we pray. Amen.